The strong smell of smoke woke Pedro in the middle of the night. His heart raced as he realized something was wrong. The orange light of the flames flickered outside the window, illuminating his room with an unsettling glow. He jumped out of bed, ran to the door, and when he opened it, he was greeted by a wave of heat that nearly knocked him over. "My God, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The kitchen was engulfed in flames, and the fire was spreading quickly throughout the living room. Pedro tried desperately to contain the flames with a fire extinguisher, but soon realized it was useless. The fire was advancing with a ferocity that he had no way of controlling. With no other alternative, he ran out into the street, screaming for help. The cold night air contrasted with the suffocating heat coming from his house. As he waited for the firefighters' sirens, he felt a mixture of despair and helplessness. Every second seemed like an eternity. Finally, the sound of the sirens echoed through the neighborhood. The firefighters arrived quickly and began to fight the flames. Pedro watched, paralyzed, as his house, and with it, much of his memories, was consumed by the fire. Suddenly, one of the firefighters, tall and agile, emerged from the flames with a box in his arms. Pedro recognized it immediately. It was the box where he kept precious photos and memories. Gratitude overcame him, but it was interrupted by a strange feeling of familiarity as he looked at the firefighter. Even with his face covered in soot, there was something in the man's eyes that seemed familiar. The firefighter approached, handing the box to Pedro. He made sure that Pedro was okay before asking in a calm but tired voice, "Do you live alone here?" Pedro nodded, still processing everything that was happening. But something in the tone of his voice awakened a dormant memory. "Wait, Lucas?" he asked, incredulous. The firefighter hesitated for a moment, studying Pedro's face. Then a small smile formed on his lips. "Pedro, is that you?" The world seemed to have stopped. There, in the middle of the night, surrounded by the ruins of a burning house, two old friends met again. And neither of them had any idea that this moment would be just the beginning of something much bigger. Pedro couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if the past had come to life before him. Lucas, the shy and reserved boy he had defended so many years ago in high school, was now there, in a firefighter's uniform, leading a team that was fighting to save what was left of his house. The night was still cold, but the heat from the flames was still intense. While the other firefighters continued working, Lucas took off his helmet, revealing a face marked by effort, but with a look that Pedro would never forget. "I never thought we would meet again like this," Pedro said, his voice full of surprise. "What happened to you after high school?" Lucas laughed, a light laugh that cut through the tension of the situation. "A lot, but I think I owe you a lot, Pedro. That day, when you defended me, something changed in me. I was lost, afraid of everything and everyone. You showed me that I didn't have to live like this." Pedro was silent for a moment, remembering the episode in the school hallway. He had no idea that that simple act of kindness had left such a deep impression on Lucas. "It was the right thing to do," Pedro replied humbly. "But it seems like you did more than overcome that. You became a hero." Lucas looked away, as if uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm not a hero, Pedro. I just try to do what you did for me. Be someone others can trust." Pedro smiled. Despite all the devastation around him, he felt a glimmer of hope. The shy boy he had known had become a strong and determined man. The two continued talking as the firefighters finished their work. Pedro told him about his life since high school. The ups and downs of pursuing his dream of being a professional player, the injuries that kept him off the court, and how he was trying to find a new purpose. On the other hand, Lucas explained how that moment in high school inspired him to want to help others, leading him to become a firefighter. The night wore on, and Pedro's house was now nothing but ruins. But instead of focusing on what he had lost, he felt something different, as if, in that reunion, he had recovered something even more valuable. Before leaving, Lucas turned to Pedro and said, "If you need help rebuilding the house, count on me. It's not just because of our history, but because I know how much rebuilding something can mean." Pedro nodded, moved. He knew those words weren't just about the house, and in that moment, a new connection began to form, based not only on the past they shared, but on the future they could build together. That night was the beginning of something that neither of them could have foreseen. Their reunion would not only bring them together again, but would set them on a path of transformation that would change their lives forever. The days following the fire were a mix of grief and resilience for Pedro. Losing his home was a hard blow, but Lucas's unexpected help seemed like a ray of hope. True to his promise, Lucas showed up the next morning with tools in hand and a smile on his face. "Where should we start?" Lucas asked, staring at the wreckage. Pedro looked at him surprised. He hadn't expected Lucas to take his promise so seriously. "You really came?" he murmured, still processing everything. "I don't even know where to start." Lucas patted him on the shoulder and said cheerfully, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out like we always have." And so they began. The work wasn't just physical, it was a journey of reconnection. As they removed the rubble and planned the reconstruction, each blow of a hammer and each piece of wood replaced seemed to bring back memories and stories from the past. "Did you know that after that day at school I started drawing stories?" Lucas asked as he helped clear the land. Pedro looked at him in surprise. "Stories? I thought you were just drawing as a hobby." Lucas laughed as he put a piece of wood in a pile. "At first, that was all. But after that day, you told me that my drawings had potential. I started to imagine that they could be something more. That's how I decided to study graphic design and become an illustrator before becoming a firefighter." Pedro shook his head, impressed. "I never thought that something so small could have such a big impact. You really turned it into something incredible." Lucas paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It wasn't small, Pedro. That day you gave me the courage to believe in myself. That's what changed everything." As they worked side by side, Pedro realized how much Lucas had changed. He was no longer the shy, insecure boy who needed protection. Lucas was now a confident, determined, and generous man, and Pedro felt inspired by him. But the impact of this reunion wasn't one-sided. Lucas also watched Pedro with admiration, seeing in him the same strength and kindness that had inspired him in the past. Despite the challenges Pedro faced, his determination to move forward was palpable. As the foundations of their new home began to be laid, the foundations of something even deeper were forming between them. Little did they know that this physical rebuilding would also be a journey of healing and personal transformation for both of them. With each day of work, Pedro's home began to take shape again, but what was really being rebuilt went far beyond the walls and roof. For Pedro, it was a chance to face the ruins of his own life and find new purpose. For Lucas, it was an opportunity to give back the strength he had once received. As they installed the beams of the new structure, Pedro stopped for a moment and looked at Lucas, who was organizing his tools on the floor. "I never thanked you for being here, you know?" Pedro said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Not just for the fire, but for not giving up on me, even after all this time." Lucas smiled discreetly, without stopping what he was doing. You've saved me before, Pedro. This is the least I can do. Besides, he continued, looking up at his friend, building something from scratch is as rewarding as putting out a fire. Pedro thought about those words. He realized that just as Lucas had found himself in the profession of firefighter, perhaps it was his turn to redefine what it meant to rebuild. Not only his home, but his own life. During breaks, the two shared stories from the past and present. Lucas told about the challenges of being a firefighter, the risky situations, and the emotional impact of saving lives. Pedro talked about his frustrations with the injury that had kept him away from basketball, and how lost he felt without a clear goal. You know, Lucas said, holding a beam while Pedro preached, life has a strange way of showing us what really matters. Maybe losing basketball was painful, but who knows? Maybe it won't lead you to something bigger. Pedro paused, thinking about that. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. I think I was so caught up in what I lost that I couldn't see what I could still build. The silence that followed was filled with the rhythmic sound of the hammer and saw, a melody that symbolized rebuilding. It was as if, with each nail and each cut of wood, Pedro was gluing together the broken pieces of his soul. One afternoon, while they were painting the walls of their new house, Pedro looked at Lucas and said, "Did you know that you changed my life too?" Lucas paused for a moment, staring at Pedro curiously. What do you mean? When I saw you in that uniform, saving not only my home, but also my memories. Pedro hesitated, trying to find the right words. It was like I realized how much our actions can impact others, even years later. You inspired me to want to be better, man. Lucas gave a shy smile, but his eyes sparkled with emotion. I guess we're even then. They both laughed, and the heaviness of the conversation gave way to a renewed lightness. It was as if the hard work and the time spent together were solidifying something that went beyond friendship, a true partnership. With each beam placed, each wall raised, Pedro and Lucas were not only rebuilding a home, but also finding renewed purpose in their lives. However, the deepest lessons were yet to come. The finishing touches on the house were being made. The structure was solid, the walls painted a refreshing white, and the new roof gleamed in the afternoon sun. Pedro and Lucas, exhausted but satisfied, sat on the makeshift porch to admire their work. The silence between them was not empty, but charged with meaning. You know, Pedro, Lucas began, looking off into the distance. When I was in high school, I felt invisible. There were days when I thought no one would notice if I just disappeared. But that day, when you stood up for me, it changed everything. Pedro, with a distant look in his eyes, listened intently as Lucas continued. You made me realize that I was important, that someone cared. That's what gave me the strength to keep going. When I decided to become a firefighter, I thought about how I wanted to be for others what you were for me. Pedro took a deep breath, absorbing each word. He had never thought about the impact of his actions in that way. For him, the act of standing up for Lucas had been something instinctive, a reflection of his sense of justice. But hearing Lucas say that it had shaped his life brought new weight to the meaning of small actions. I don't think I ever imagined that such a simple gesture could change so much, Pedro said, his voice thick with emotion. I was so focused on what I lost recently, on my home, on basketball, that I forgot to look at the impact I can have on others. Lucas smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. Life has a funny way of teaching us. Sometimes it's the little things that matter the most. This isn't just about rebuilding a house, Pedro. You're rebuilding your confidence, your faith, in what you can do. Pedro nodded, looking down at his work-hardened hands. He finally understood that the physical reconstruction was just a symbol. Every hammer blow, every piece of wood replaced, was a reflection of what was happening inside him. "Lucas," Pedro began, breaking the silence, "you were a reminder that there's still purpose, even when everything seems lost. I think the fire destroyed a lot, but it brought you back, and that..." He paused, trying to control his emotion. "That's worth more than anything." Lucas put his hand on Pedro's shoulder, squeezing it lightly. "And you reminded me why I started all this. Because sometimes, someone needs a push to see what's possible. That's what you did for me. And now it's my turn to give back." As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the newly rebuilt house, the two fell silent. Their friendship, which had been forged in an act of courage years ago, was now stronger than ever. With the house finally completed, Pedro and Lucas were ready to move on. But what they had learned together would not be just a memory. It would be a foundation for everything they would build from there. With the last shingle in place and the finishing touches made, Pedro and Lucas stood on the sidewalk, contemplating the now fully restored house. The silence between them was loaded with meaning, as if every hammer strike, every brush stroke, and every conversation had solidified itself in the walls of that house. The sun was setting on the horizon, tinting the sky orange and gold. Pedro took a deep breath, feeling for the first time in a long time a sense of relief and belonging. "You know, Lucas," Pedro began softly, "I never imagined that I could start over. When I saw my house being consumed by the flames, it felt like everything was over. But now I see. Sometimes losing something gives us the chance to rebuild something even better." Lucas smiled, silently agreeing. He picked up a piece of wood that was left over and held it in his hands. "Pedro, this is not just a house. It is a symbol of friendship, of overcoming, and of how even in the most difficult moments, we can find the strength to start over. And you, more than anyone, deserve this." Pedro looked at Lucas, his eyes shining with gratitude. "And you, Lucas, showed me how much small actions can reverberate. When I defended you that day at school, I never thought that this could mean so much. Now I know that everything we do, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives." They stared at each other for a moment, a knowing smile appearing on their faces. Their friendship was now more than a memory. It was a partnership for life. With the house finished, Pedro looked at Lucas and said playfully, "So, what's next? Are you going to help me furnish it too?" Lucas laughed out loud, the sound echoing through the quiet night air. "Only if you promise not to make me paint again. I'm terrible at that." As the laughter filled the room, Pedro felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He knew the journey didn't end there, but with Lucas's support and the renewed strength within him, he was ready for whatever came next. Pedro and Lucas's story reminds us that even in the midst of the greatest loss, there is always an opportunity to start over. Small acts of kindness can resonate for years and change lives in ways we never imagined. Share this story with someone special, and if you also have a story of overcoming or reconnecting, send it to our channel. Who knows? Maybe your experience will inspire others to rebuild their lives too. So Pedro and Lucas moved on, taking with them not only the lessons of the past, but also the certainty that together, they had rebuilt much more than a house. They had rebuilt themselves.